In September 2026, a Long Island courtroom will become the setting for a legal confrontation between traditional evidence standards and the cutting edge of forensic science. Rex Heuermann, a 60-year-old Manhattan architect, will stand trial for 7 murders. The outcome hinges on DNA technology never before tested in a New York courtroom. This is Case Files Explained. Today we examine how one trial could redefine the future of criminal prosecution and determine whether justice delayed can still be justice delivered. What links a pizza crust discarded on a Manhattan sidewalk to 7 women found dead across 3 decades? The answer lies in a single strand of hair. For 13 years, the Gilgo Beach murders remained Long Island's most haunting cold case. Then investigators deployed technology that reads more than 100,000 genetic markers from microscopic evidence. The prosecution believes this technology proves guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense calls it unproven junk science. Jury will decide who is right. The Gilgo Beach case began with a December discovery in 2010. A police officer training his cadaver dog along Ocean Parkway stumbled onto remains hidden in the brush. Within days, investigators found 4 bodies wrapped in burlap sacks. All were young women who had worked as escorts and advertised their services on Craigslist. The victims: Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, had disappeared between 2007 and 2010. Their bodies laid just miles apart along the same roadside. Suffolk County launched its largest investigation in history. Detectives interviewed thousands. They traced phone records, analyzed DNA, and searched for patterns. But the trail went cold. For more than a decade, the case remained unsolved. Families waited for answers. Investigators retired without closure. The killer, if there was one killer, remained free. Then, in 2022, a new investigative task force applied emerging DNA technology to decades-old evidence. They found something previous tests had missed. Whole-genome sequencing can extract a complete genetic profile from evidence too degraded for traditional testing. A single hair shaft, not even the root, can yield a full DNA signature. This technology examines more than 100,000 genetic markers. Traditional DNA testing looks at only 20. The difference allows investigators to identify individuals with unprecedented precision. Using this method, investigators found male DNA on evidence recovered from 6 of 7 victims. The genetic profile matched across multiple crime scenes, suggesting a single perpetrator. But investigators still needed to identify whose DNA it was. The profile wasn't in any law enforcement database. They needed a suspect to compare it against. The task force began surveillance on Rex Heuermann, an architect who lived in Massapequa Park. His name had appeared peripherally in the original investigation, but was never seriously pursued. On July 14, 2023, investigators followed Heuermann to Manhattan. When he discarded a pizza crust into a public trash can, an officer retrieved it. The DNA matched. That same day, officers arrested Rex Heuermann outside his Midtown office. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He has maintained his innocence from the start. In the months following his arrest, prosecutors added charges. First, the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes in January 2024. Then, in June 2024, charges for Sandra Costilla and Jessica Taylor. The Sandra Costilla charge pushed the timeline back to 1993, 30 years before Heuermann's arrest. Prosecutors allege he killed for 3 decades while living an outwardly normal life. During searches of Heuermann's home and office, investigators seized more than 350 electronic devices. The contents, prosecutors claim, reveal a pattern of violent obsession. According to court filings, those devices contained what prosecutors describe as a significant collection of violent bondage and torture pornography, some dating back to 1994. Investigators also found what they call a blueprint, evidence suggesting Heuermann planned his alleged crimes with excruciating detail and researched ways to avoid detection. The defense has not disputed that DNA was found at the crime scenes. Instead, they are challenging whether the technology used to identify it should be admissible in court. Under New York law, novel scientific evidence must pass a Frye hearing. Prosecutors must prove the technology is generally accepted within the relevant scientific community. Whole genome sequencing from hair shafts has never been admitted in a New York criminal trial. The defense argues it remains experimental, too new for courtroom reliability. The prosecution counters that the science is peer-reviewed and replicated. They have enlisted forensic experts to testify that whole genome sequencing meets the Frye standard. The defense has also challenged the pizza crust collection. They argue that obtaining DNA from discarded items without a warrant violates Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search. Courts have generally held that abandoned items carry no expectation of privacy, but the defense argues that genetic information is fundamentally different from ordinary trash. DNA contains the most intimate information about a person: family relationships, health predispositions, ancestry. The defense argues it deserves heightened privacy protection. These legal challenges have proceeded alongside trial preparation. Both sides have filed hundreds of motions. The judge has ruled on evidence disputes, witness lists, and procedural matters. One critical ruling came on the question of trial consolidation. The defense argued for 7 separate trials, one for each victim, to prevent prejudicial spillover between cases. The prosecution argued for a single trial, contending that the cases share common evidence, methods, and alleged motive. Separating them would require victims' families to endure multiple proceedings. Judge Timothy Mazzei ruled that all 7 murders will be tried together. He determined the efficiency and evidentiary connections justified a consolidated proceeding. The judge also set an immovable start date. He declared that come hell or high water, the trial will begin shortly after Labor Day 2026. There will be no further delays. The trial is expected to last several months. Prosecutors have identified more than 100 potential witnesses. The defense has retained its own forensic experts to challenge the DNA evidence. Throughout these proceedings, Heuermann has remained in custody without bail. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges and continues to assert his innocence through counsel. His wife filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. His adult children have not spoken publicly. The family home in Massapequa Park, where investigators found key evidence, remains sealed. For the families of the 7 victims, the trial represents decades of waiting. Some have organized victim advocacy groups. Others have spoken about wanting accountability, not just a verdict. The Gilgo Beach case has also prompted broader questions about how Long Island law enforcement handled missing persons reports involving sex workers. Families say their loved ones were dismissed. Advocates argue that had investigators taken the initial disappearances more seriously, additional deaths might have been prevented. The delayed response, they contend, reflects systemic bias. The trial will not directly address these systemic questions, but prosecutors have acknowledged the long road to justice and expressed commitment to presenting a thorough case for each victim. Beyond this specific case, the trial carries implications for forensic science nationwide. Whole genome sequencing could revolutionize cold case investigations, if courts accept it. Traditional DNA testing requires biological material containing cell nuclei, blood, saliva, or hair roots. Hair shafts alone, which lack nuclei, previously yielded no usable genetic information. Whole genome sequencing extracts nuclear DNA from the keratin structure of hair shafts themselves. This allows identification from evidence that would have been worthless under older methods. The technology has been validated in academic research and published in peer-reviewed journals. But courtroom admissibility requires meeting legal standards beyond scientific publication. The legal standard asks whether the scientific community accepts the methodology. Courts look at error rates, testing protocols, and whether independent laboratories can replicate results. Prosecutors in the Heuermann case have arranged for multiple laboratories to independently verify their DNA findings. They aim to demonstrate that results are consistent and reproducible. The defense has retained its own experts who question the technology's reliability. They argue that contamination risks and interpretation variability undermine confidence in the results. This expert battle will unfold before the jury. Both sides will present competing interpretations of the same evidence. Jurors will ultimately decide whose science they trust. The Frye hearing on DNA admissibility has already occurred. While the full ruling remains sealed, the judge's decision to proceed to trial suggests he found the prosecution's scientific basis sufficient. If whole genome sequencing evidence leads to conviction, the ruling will create precedent. Other New York prosecutors could use the same technology in cold cases involving degraded DNA evidence. Police departments across the country are watching this trial. Thousands of cold cases contain hair evidence that could not previously be tested. A favorable ruling opens new investigative pathways. The technology also raises privacy concerns beyond this case. If police can extract full genetic profiles from any discarded hair, the implications for surveillance expand dramatically. Civil liberties groups have filed amicus briefs warning of a slippery slope. They argue that genetic privacy deserves stronger protection than courts have traditionally granted to abandoned property. The defense has incorporated these broader privacy arguments into their motion to suppress the pizza crust evidence. They frame the collection as genetic surveillance without constitutional safeguards. These legal questions will likely outlast the Heuermann trial. Appeals are expected regardless of verdict. The case may eventually reach New York's highest court, or even federal appellate review. The Frye hearing outcome sets precedent for future cold case prosecutions. If whole genome sequencing gains admissibility, expect increased investment in testing degraded evidence from unsolved crimes. Watch for rulings on Heuermann's statements to police. If suppressed, the prosecution will rely more heavily on physical evidence. If admitted, jurors will hear his own words. The trial outcome could establish standards for whole genome sequencing nationwide. Other jurisdictions are likely to follow New York's framework if the evidence survives appellate review. Families of missing persons in unsolved cases should consult with victim advocacy organizations. New DNA technologies may offer investigative options that were previously unavailable. For those following the case, court proceedings will be partially open to the public. Suffolk County has indicated that some testimony may be streamed, consistent with open court principles. The presumption of innocence applies until verdict. While the evidence presented publicly appears substantial, only jurors who hear all testimony can properly assess credibility and weight. Media coverage will intensify as trial approaches. Consider consuming court documents and official statements rather than relying solely on secondhand interpretation. The Gilgo Beach trial represents a convergence of tragedy, technology, and law. 7 women lost their lives. 13 years passed without answers. Scientific innovation may finally deliver accountability. But technology alone cannot render justice. Human judgment, 12 jurors evaluating evidence, remains the constitutional mechanism. The science informs the decision. It does not make it. Whether Rex Heuermann is ultimately convicted or acquitted, this trial will reshape how courts evaluate forensic evidence. The precedent will endure long after the verdict is read. For the families who waited more than a decade, the trial offers something they were denied for years: the attention of a system finally prepared to listen. We will continue covering this case as it proceeds. Until then, This has been Case Files Explained.